I'm going to introduce this paper that I read recently that I think is really fascinating and shows the trends of AI usage in the field of science. So let's get to it. In Nature Human Behavior, there is a paper by Liang and Zhang and colleagues who wrote about quantifying how much AI is being used, especially the large language models, in the writing of scientific research papers. And what they found is fascinating. Since the launch of ChatGPT at the end of November of 2022, there's been really an explosion of LLM use in scientific writing, especially the amount of the scientific content that's generated with AI. They validated how accurate they were able to estimate the amount of content that is modified by LLM models because their estimation error was less than 3.5%, which is fairly impressive. Perhaps not so surprisingly, the largest and fastest growth in LLM use in writing in science has been in the field of computer science, where there is a faster turnaround of research papers because the field changes so quickly. Of course, your rate of publication is going to be faster than other fields, say math or physics. Also, there's a higher fraction of content that's generated by LLM if in an overcrowded space. And I think that points to the overly competitive nature of science, where you want to be the first one to disseminate knowledge, the discovery that you put your heart and soul in. And I think it invites the use of AI in the name of productivity because the publications, the quantification of publications especially, is so directly linked to the general perceived impact of the scientist and also qualification for faculty jobs. The speed of publication or quantity of publication does not mean quality. In fact, AI is linked to lower quality publications. If you're just churning data into a story that sticks and see what happens, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead to new treatments or advancing knowledge, new discoveries that no one has thought about. Also, just because it's published online, either in a journal article or book, doesn't mean that it has no limitations. No scientific research has no limitations. And I think this is where the public needs to see the limitations pointed out by the authors themselves in the discussion section of the paper or by other peer-reviewed reviewers. But of course, those original content rarely gets consumed by the public directly. Most people, if you're not in the academic community, are going to read the interpretation of the paper or the interpretation of the paper. So I say that information derivatives that are sometimes going to dilute the original meaning, or the nuanced understanding gets lost in the translation. And I think there is a critical failure on the societal part that we as a society having a shorter attention span. And also we have this general expectations for immediate gratification. So we want the answers right away. We don't want to think through the process of getting to the result. We just want to get the answers right away. And that short summary culture, or the things that we want right away, the immediacy of it, is really hurting our way to think for ourselves and our critical thinking skills. Because in one way that we are actually drawn to the facade of certainty of truth, even though we may not have all the right information or enough information to say anything about it. But because someone said so, we are going to take that and put our own opinion into it and then respond to a headline instead of reading the article ourselves. So that's one concern that I have about this. Another is the similarity of content. Scientists not knowing how to communicate their research in a way that is accessible to general audience. Usually, scientific papers are not written for the general public. They're written for people in the academic community who have access to the background knowledge and know what the words mean. But for the general audience, the taxpayers, which mostly fund these research papers, are not getting the easy access. And in fact, because of there's a lack of nuanced understanding of the things that we're talking about, that we are actually drawn to these tools to rely on to summarize the papers, to not think about it, not removing the, almost bypassing the need for asking questions about it because we just want the answer. Asking questions like, what was the sample size? Is it valid methods? Is there any uncertainty around the results itself? Potential biases? All these things where data may be objective, but the way we interpret the data itself is purely human. This paper found another trend about the adoption of LLM use in scientific writing based on the regions. Okay, so here's where the authors used the author affiliation as a proxy for the author's country of origin, but of course that's a limitation, which they pointed out themselves in their discussion. English is a universal language, but of course it may put people who don't use English as a first language at a disadvantage. And so the potential benefit of LLM is that they're putting everyone of diverse backgrounds on equal footing. So now everybody has access to the opportunity to present their research and create impact regardless of where they're from and regardless of what language they use. But I think an additional concern related to that is understanding how similar these contents become after going through ChatGPT modifications. Some of the wording or phrases become very similar, and you can even tell whether this was written by ChatGPT or not at this point, right? And I think it's really interesting inflection point where we think about how much is this useful, how much can we extract as a benefit versus what is the danger or threat of using this as a tool. Robots are really good at template matching. And essentially what it is doing is the language prediction models are able to create something based off of the outline, which I know about scientific writing tends to have a pretty rigid of a structure. And so if you give them clear enough instructions of what to write and how to write it, ChatGPT or other AI models are going to be able to generate content and will create an output for you. But the problem is the writing style is going to be fairly similar from one another. And so this brings up a question that I wanted to give you all is, are we using these tools in a way to reduce our own humanity, our own individual personality, and almost minimizing ourselves as individual people, even in the rigid, structured space of scientific writing? And I think that's critical because that leads to the intellectual diversity, creativity, and really the way that we communicate science to people becomes very much of a cookie cutter fashion. And is science going to be as engaging if everything sounds the same? So that's something that I'm curious to see what you all think about. And lastly, being able to increase our own critical thinking skills is something that I always worry about as a neuroscientist looking at this explosion of AI, is our ability to think for ourselves and how gradual this change is happening. We are willingly giving away the right to think, or even need to think about things. We're constantly checking ChatGPT to write a response for a text to our friends. We're not able to think for ourselves of what to write or how to phrase it based on our personality and based on our language abilities. We're relying on these tools to do it for us. And slowly, but surely, we are losing our ability to need to think. And I think that's a terrifying thing. So comment below, let me know what you think about how much AI should be used in science, if at all, and where do we draw the line? Is it, where we stop at, fixing the grammatical errors or the typos, to generating the entire content from the outline of a paper, or summarizing papers for a review paper, synthesizing all these different ideas and putting together into a review paper? That's already being used. Where do we draw the line as a valid socially acceptable way to present research assisted by AI. So I'm curious to see your thoughts.